Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our update on veterinary feed directives. This webinar is sponsored by the United States Aquaculture Society, the National Aquaculture Association, and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Today we have with us two veterinarians, Dr. Pat Gaunt and Guppy Blair, who are going to give us an update on the veterinary feed directives. Pat is a retired professor from Mississippi State, and I will just go ahead and turn it over to you, Pat. If you'd like to give additional introduction, feel free, but I will step out to monitor the waiting room and let folks in as they come.
Thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here to share this information I have on veterinary feed directive drugs. I worked in the catfish industry for over 23 years, providing health care for fishes in the catfish industry. And I wrote close to a little over 1,000 VFD orders during that time. And today I'm going to show you how I use these VFD drugs during my career. And I complied with regulations, some of which were under challenging circumstances. So on the agenda for today, I have 6 important considerations for treating fish with VFD drugs. The veterinary client-patient relationship comes first. The required diagnostics. We'll talk about the approved label claims for VFD drugs and how to complete the VFD order form, and using VFD drugs both on-label and off-label, and then overcoming the lack of support for aquaculture in certain geographic areas and navigating some of these issues. So the first responsibility that I want to talk about with VFD drugs are those of the veterinarian. And the veterinarian has to either establish or maintain a veterinary client-patient relationship. And he or she's going to do this by having knowledge of the fish health or the husbandry by recent diagnostic examination of the fish or a visit to the farm. And also the veterinarian is going to have to assess the health of the fish and the need for medical treatment, whether or not VFD drugs are going to be an asset to the fish in overcoming the health problems. The veterinarian also has to be licensed in the state where the fish are going to be treated and issue an order for the drugs in writing to both the farmer and send a copy to the distributor of the feed. Now, while the medication is being used, the veterinarian has to have oversight for proper use of the medication and be available for any follow-up care, any complications or questions that the farmer may have about using the feed or concerns. The veterinarian also has to maintain medical records, and either these VFD order forms can be in the form of electronic records or hard copy originals, and these have to be maintained for a minimum of 2 years under federal regulations, and some states are going to require that these be maintained for longer than 2 years. Oops. Okay. And under the VCPR, of course, the client does have responsibilities as well. And the client has to cooperate with the veterinarian to maintain this VCPR by following the dose rate of the drugs that are prescribed, the duration of use as mandated by FDA, the expiration date on the VFD order, and the withdrawal time for food fish that are going to be slaughtered to make sure that there are no residues remaining in the fillets. And the client, of course, does have to maintain his or her copy of the VFD order for the same length of time as a veterinarian. So the veterinarian, once the VCPR is established, goes about making a diagnosis on these fish by the examination. And in order to write an order for veterinary feed directive drugs, all that's required is a clinical diagnosis. The clinical signs and lesions on live fish, or just the lesions on the dead fish. And this is part of the Animal Drug Availability Act that tells the veterinarian the requirements for making the diagnosis. So they can use this clinical diagnosis and the same day order the VFD drug, and they are complying with this Animal Drug Availability Act. Of course, other tests can be done. And what we always did was, while we were in the fish, take a sterile culture of the organs within the fish, the spleen or the kidney and the brain, and incubate these, and then look for the results, see if we could recover the bacteria and assess the susceptibility of the bacteria to the veterinary feed directive drugs. But it's not necessary to wait for these results of the susceptibility test or any of the other assays before prescribing the VFD drug. These are the 3 approved VFD feeds for treating aquatic bacterial infections that we have here in the US. Romet, which is a sulfagamma-thoxine with ormetaprim potentiator, terramycin, which is oxytetracycline, and Aquaflor or fluorphenicol. And I've listed the websites and links to the sponsors of these particular drugs on this slide. They contain a lot of very useful information on there. A veterinarian can download the VFD order forms. There are some links to regulations, and there are answered questions that have been sent in to some of the sponsors about their drug or about complying with some of the regulations. So it's a very helpful website associated with each of the drugs. And while we've got these 3 drugs listed together, I just do want to remind everybody that we have only 3 drugs in aquaculture, and we need to be very good stewards and maintain these drugs to ensure that they remain efficacious for us in helping to combat the bacterial infections that we have in aquaculture. So we should be using them judiciously and following the regulations on their use. Okay, so each of the VFD drugs has a nice little table set up here with label claims. I'm just going to briefly flip through these. And each of the drugs has a handful of indications. You can see 2 of them here for the Romet drugs. And then for the species, the groups of fishes are mostly broad that are listed here, like the salmonids. And these will include many species of fishes, which gives us some flexibility in using these drugs. So Romet is labeled for salmonids, and this does include several different species. You can see Aquaflor over here is labeled for freshwater reared finfish, fight Flavobacterium columnaris or columnaris disease. And these are going to cover fishes such as tilapia, hybrid striped bass, catfish that are cultured here in the US. The dose rates and the withdrawal times are set by FDA, and there's no flexibility associated with these for the on-use label of these particular drugs. Okay, so this is the VFD order form, and FDA mandates that there is certain required information that must be included on all the VFD order forms when ordering these drugs. You can get these order forms from the sponsors of the drugs, and I've listed their websites previously. The AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, does have a VFD order form. There is a company, at least one that I'm aware of, Global Vet Link, that has electronic forms, that has a secure database where these can be transmitted from the veterinarian directly to the farmer and to the distributor of the medicated feed mills. But this, if you're using electronic forms, this has to be done on a secure database. Veterinarians can also create their own VFD order forms, but just as a reminder, it has to contain all the required information that FDA has requested. So to visualize these order forms, I'm going to literally kind of cut this order form in half so we can see this just a little more clearly, and we'll go on with the required information. Okay, so of course the name of the drug is important to have on here, and the ones that are provided by the sponsors have that bolded on their bolded on their order forms. So the first bit of information is the name, address, and phone number for the farmer and the veterinarian involved. Then we have to complete the identification of the animals to be treated and include the species of the fishes, the approximate number of fish in there, along with the production class. So were there 1 million fingerlings in this pond or 100,000 food-sized fish? That's the type of information that we have to have. And we also want the location of the fish. What ponds are they in on the farm? Are they in ponds 53 North, 123? So each of the ponds has to be listed on this order form. And then we're going to be looking at the condition or the disease that's being treated. And you can see here that there are 5 conditions that can be treated, 5 indications on this form for the chlorophenicol product, as well as the species of fishes. And the veterinarian needs to sign with initials over in this box over here to indicate which indication is being treated with this order. Next, we come to the amount of drug to be mixed and the duration of use. So what they're looking for is how many grams of the product per ton of feed is going to be mixed in during this order. This is driven by the feeding rate of the fish, and that's based on the percent weight of the fish. So most of our catfish farmers wanted to feed their fingerling fish a 3% body weight product. And so if you look in this nice form that's been generated by Merck Animal Health, you'll see that for the 10 milligram per kilogram body weight dosage, that 300 grams per ton of feed is what is put into a ton of feed here. So up in this blank, you'd pull this number off and enter 300 grams of chlorophenicol per ton of feed. The feeding rate, as we mentioned, was 3% for this particular example. And the duration here is that this is fed as the sole ration once a day for 10 consecutive days. Okay, and the box at the bottom here has special instructions in it. And for online, for the on-label usage of these VFD drugs, I usually leave this blank, or sometimes I would fill in with the feed mill that the order is being sent to. I would usually hand this off to someone in the front office, and they would make sure that it got to the feed mill or the distributor, and we want to make sure the right order is going to the right supplier. Okay, so here we are again with the bottom half of the VFD order form, and you can see the special instruction box up there. Okay, we have to have on these forms that extra label use is strictly prohibited, is not allowed in the use of medicated feeds. And this is prohibited by AMDUCA, the Animal Drug and Clarification Act. And Dr. Guppy Blair is going to talk a little bit about extra label drug use and the forbidden drugs after I finish up this session. So she'll go a little bit more in depth on that. Also included here is the residue warning or cautionary statements. For this particular drug, it has to be withdrawn 15 days prior to slaughter to make sure there are no residues in the fillets. And then finally, the veterinarian is going to sign this form and the date that the drug was ordered, the date of issuance down here. They'll enter an expiration date as well. And FDA has extended this up to 6 months from the date of issuance. And that's entirely at the veterinarian's discretion. In the Mississippi Delta, we had the infrastructure to get our medicated feed the same day for the farmers. So if they needed 20 tons of medicated feed, the feed mill could deliver that same day. But we're not so lucky in other parts of the country where the infrastructure is not there for the fish farmers. And some hatcheries or farms have to order this medicated feed weeks in advance. And so what can happen here, as long as there's a veterinary client-patient relationship in place, the veterinarian can write this VFD order not to expire, not to exceed 6 months from the date of issuance. And the feed can be ordered weeks in advance of an anticipated outbreak of these diseases. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through the presentation. I've got the little orange circles at the very, very bottom to remind me to tell you that 3 copies have to be issued with this order. The veterinarian gets the original one, and a copy goes to the client, and a copy goes to the feed mill. Okay, at the very bottom here, with the pink arrows, I have the number of refills, if it's permitted by approval, and the affirmation intent for combination of drugs. And currently, these do not apply in aquaculture. They're usually not on the sponsor's drug forms. But if they are on a form that you fill out, say, for instance, the AVMA form, just put a blank line through it or write NA, because they're not applicable in aquaculture now. Okay, so we'll talk, compare the online labeling of these VFD drugs, the use of them on label versus extra label drug use of these drugs. So again, if the fish species and diseases resemble those on the label, you just issue the VFD order. It's very straightforward. But if the signs of the lesions don't resemble those on the label and there are no approved treatments available and mortality of the fish can result by not using medicated feed, because there is none approved, you can use this VFD drug off label through a compliance policy guide issued by FDA, and it's 615115. Okay, now it's still illegal by AMDUCA, but FDA is not going to penalize veterinarians, the producers, or the distributors that work together to get this feed delivered to a farmer so that he or she can use this in an extra label fashion. Now, before it can be delivered, the veterinarian have to complete the VFD order form and annotate that special instructions box that we talked about. And I'll show you more of that in a second. And the extra labeled letter or a form has to be completed to use these VFD feeds off label. So again, technically under AMDUCA, this use of the medicated feeds off label is illegal, but through this compliance policy guideline, FDA is allowing us some regulatory discretion for minor species. And there's specific conditions under which these drugs can be extra labeled. And again, there's no penalty as long as the veterinarian, the farmer, and the distributor comply with these conditions. Now, after all of that, when you go and talk to veterinarians, they still have concern over the potential disciplinary action that FDA could potentially exercise under AMDUCA. So you do the best at explaining this and hope that they understand. Veterinary students really need to be taught this in school. I found that some of them just blindly say that you can't extra label the medicated feeds, when in fact the compliance policy guide says that we can. Okay, so this is the top half of this VFD order form, and you'll see the special instructions box down at the bottom, and I entered this in bold red so that we all could see it. And you have to enter some kind of statement saying that this is being used in accordance with this guide that FDA has issued, and it's being used in an extra label fashion. Okay, if the fish species is not on this label, this VFD order form, you have to enter the fish species down in this special instructions box. And if you're going to deviate from the drug's approved withdrawal time, that has to be entered under this special instruction box also. So if we're using this drug in catfish, we go up here and you'll see that catfish are on the label. So you circle this species. You don't have to circle the indication because it's not being used for Edwardsiella ictaluri, which is on label. So just circle this catfish. If you recall from the bottom half of this form, the withdrawal time was 15 days. And if the veterinarian wants that withdrawal time set at 15 days, you don't have to annotate this special instructions box. So here's an example of a letter that has to go out to the farmer if you're going to extra label drugs, these VFD drugs for him. You have to date it within 6 months prior to the use. The letter is addressed to the fish farmer. And you have to explain this whole process and justify why you're doing it in this letter. So we're going to use Aquaculture medicated feed in accordance with this guide, and it's going to be used for the control of mortality associated with Aeromonas veronii, which is not on label, okay? And this is going to be used in catfish in certain ponds under the following conditions. The dose rate of 10 milligrams of the fluorophenocal active ingredient per body weight of fish per day is being used. The duration of treatments is set at 1 time a day for 10 consecutive days. Withdrawal time is going to be 15 days prior to slaughter. And all of the requirements that are mandated by using a VFD drug have to be observed. And they can reference the order and the label that comes with the medicated feed. And the reason we're doing this is there's not an approved drug for treatment of veronii available that the fish farmer can access in their locale. And the farmer does have to keep this letter for 2 years, and it's subject to FDA audit. So again, this letter goes to the farmer, and the veterinarian keeps one on file. It does not have to go to the distributor. Merck Animal Health also has an example of an authorization form for this extra label drug use of VFD medicated feed. And I'm going to see if Zoom's going to let me click this hyperlink. I hope that will, because they've got a great form, and there it is. Yeah. So this is on that website that I was telling you about. There's a lot of information here, and this form can be completed too. A lot of this information is the same up at the top that's required for the VFD order. So then we get to the nitty gritty. They want to know the animal or the species that's being treated. If it's catfish, put catfish. The diagnosis, you can put the bacteria that's off label there, and which product we're using. Are we using the terramycin product? Are we using Aquaculture? Are we using the Romet product? And the dose, the duration of treatment. It's once a day for 5 days for Romet, okay? Once a day for 10 days for terramycin. That has to be listed. And the ponds or the vats where these animals are going to be treated. And then you have to list the withdrawal time on here. Some people choose to extend this withdrawal time on the VFD order. They're being a little conservative, perhaps, or perhaps they have reason to believe that, say, for Aquaculture, 10 days is not an adequate amount of time for the withdrawal when they're using it in an extra label fashion. This is something that the veterinarian should research or reach out to colleagues, to FDA, FARAD, the Food Animal Residue Avoidance Database, specializes in extra label use of drugs, and perhaps they can offer some advice there.
Excuse me, Pat,
Yes.
the form was not visible.
Oh, I'm so sorry. All right. Well, I'll just get out of this thing here then and go back to my, okay, let's see.
You may have to reshare.
Okay. Yeah, so are you seeing my screen now?
We see the PowerPoint.
PowerPoint, okay. Yeah, I apologize that, but if you get a chance to review this PowerPoint online, please do so, and you should be able to hit the hyperlinks. I can hit them here, but it's not going to share. I was afraid of that in Zoom. Okay, so anyway, there's another form there if you prefer to use that. Okay, so here's a little quiz here. And I want to know if whether or not the VFD feed that was prescribed for this fish is being used on or off label. Okay, so this fish was sent into the Mississippi State Fish Diagnostic Lab, and you can see that there's this hole in the head. You can see exophthalmia, or these bulging eyes associated with this disease, suggesting maybe there's some fluid retention in this fish. And when the fish was actually opened up, the coelomic cavity had a lot of fluid. The abdominal cavity had fluid in it. There was a spleen that was enlarged and congested. And then there was some hemorrhage throughout the gut. So the veterinarian that saw this fish diagnosed enteric septicemia of catfish associated with Edwardsiella ictaluri. And if you glanced at those tables that I set up on those specific drugs, we actually have 2 drugs that have a label claim for ESC associated with Edwardsiella ictaluri, Romet and Aquaculture. So while the veterinarian was in this fish's coelomic cavity, he or she took the sterile cultures of the kidney and the brain and cultured them for bacteria and incubated them. And the same day, the veterinarian treated with a VFD feed. Okay, the next day, when they were checking the cultures, the crew at the diagnostic lab noticed that this culture grew at 28 degrees in 24 hours. And this is not characteristic of Edwardsiella ictaluri. It takes 48 hours for it to start growing up. Well, the culture that grew at 24 hours had phenotypic characteristics of Edwardsiella piscicida, which is not on label. So my question for you to think about is whether or not this VFD feed was issued on or off label. And in fact, it was issued on label. Remember, we talked at the very beginning of this presentation that the Animal Drug Availability Act does allow veterinarians to treat patients according to the clinical signs and lesions. So that initiated treatment with the on-label Edwardsiella ictaluri treatments is considered valid, okay? The bottom line here is that if this looks like ESC, it can be treated on label as ESC. Okay, and so the last point that we have to make here is that unfortunately there is a lack of availability of veterinarians for healthcare in some parts of the U.S. My good friend and colleague, Dr. Niffen, calls this a geographic maldistribution, which is quite succinct. And so I'm licensed also in Arkansas, and during my career, I would make several trips over to Arkansas to work with an extension agent over there, and he would take me around to the farms so I could develop a VCPR with the farmers. And when they ran into problems that they needed medicated feed, I had that relationship with the farmers, and I could get information from them and from the extension agent and feel comfortable in writing the VFD orders to help medicate these fishes. Also, there are organizations, I'll put a plug in for the American Association of Fish Veterinarians, that are willing to help practitioners, small animal practitioners, large animal practitioners in their journey to become a little more proficient in fish medicine, so they can send in questions to the organizations, and people will help and help guide them along. There are also continuing education courses that are being presented at veterinarians meetings. I'm going to give one in Arkansas next month to a bunch of veterinarians who are going there primarily to get large animal, equine, dog and cat medicine. So we're going to be there with our aquatic medicine, a couple of hours of presentations on that. There are some other solutions when there are no in-person licensed aquatic veterinarians. You can, a farmer can overnight ship some dead fresh fish that have been cooled with these refrigerator packs to an aquatic lab. A veterinary client-patient relationship does have to be in effect, and the veterinarian does have to be licensed in the farm state. So as long as there's been some kind of in-person meeting with these farmers, this is a valid approach to the diagnostics and treatment of these fish. Telehealth medicine is very popular, in particular in cat medicine, where this lady has her cat here, and you can see her next to a computer screen with a veterinarian, and he's looking at some skin lesions and making a diagnosis. And this can happen very easily with fish, where farmers can get their dead fresh fish and show a veterinarian the lesions, or open up the abdominal cavity on the fish, and they can discuss the lesions, and the veterinarian can make a diagnosis based on that. The veterinarian that's making these diagnoses does have to be licensed in the state where the fish are being raised. There is a guidance for industry that was issued by FDA. I think it's 269. It was issued by FDA back in the COVID pandemic, where people were afraid to mix and were terrified of getting COVID. And so FDA kind of waived this VCPR, in-person VCPR for a while. But I see that under, this was rescinded back in December of this past year, 2022. And it's actually going to go out of effect in February 21st of this year. So there's still a little time to do some telehealth medicine without the in-person VCPR, if anyone's interested. Okay, the other problem that we have here is the lack of access to medicated feed in some communities. We're spoiled in the catfish industry because the catfish industry has the infrastructure in place. We can get VFD orders filled the same day from the local medicated feed mills, and the farmers on the way to treatment. So without these medicated feed mills, the farmer needs to be keeping very good records, and FDA recognized that if there's indication that during certain times of the year, these outbreaks of bacterial disease will occur, they can get together with their veterinarian under the VCPR and can order the veterinarians can order the medicated feed for the farmers several weeks prior to these disease outbreaks in anticipation of when the disease outbreaks actually occur. And a veterinarian, as I mentioned, can write this VFD order for up to 6 months. So that'll give the distributor of the medicated feed enough time to ship that feed over to the hatchery or to the farm, and the farmer can receive it and then start using it when these outbreaks actually occur. If the farmer has the feed and maybe the VFD order wasn't written for up to 6 months, maybe just a couple of months, and it's starting to expire, the veterinarian can reissue a new VFD order. So in summary, for the use of this VFD feed, the veterinarians do have to be licensed with VCPR to order these medicated feeds. The Animal Drug Availability Act does allow the veterinarians to simply use a clinical diagnosis for treatment with the medicated feeds. And we all have to come to grips that there are only 3 approved VFD feeds for use in aquaculture. So we all have to do our part to use these judiciously to make sure that they're going to remain efficacious. The FDA does use its enforcement discretion under the guide that it issues for the extra label use of the drugs, the VFD feeds in aquaculture, and there's no penalty as long as these guides are being followed. And under the valid VCPR, a veterinarian can order medicated feeds for farms prior to an outbreak in anticipation of the outbreak so that the feeds are going to be available for treatment. And finally, for those geographic areas that are underserved by veterinarians, for the diagnoses of the diseases in the fish, the practitioners can team up with extension agents in the area. Farmers can ship the fish to aquatic diagnostic labs for an opinion from a veterinarian skilled in aquatic medicine. And veterinarians can work with farmers by telehealth medicine. Again, the VCPR does have to be in place with all of these circumstances, and the veterinarian does have to be licensed in the state where the fish are being farmed. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. If you would. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Dr. Guppy Blair, who is the section chief, the branch chief with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service Animal Aquatic Drug Approval Partnership. And she's coming to us today from Bozeman, Montana. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, David, and hello, everyone. As Pat mentioned already, my part in this webinar is to talk about the basics of veterinary extra labeled drug use, or ELDU. So I'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, you might just ask a simple question, well, what is ELDU, or extra labeled drug use? So it is when an approved animal or animal drug is used in a way that isn't listed on the drug's label. And the way we can do this is in 1994, Congress passed the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act. And this allows veterinarians in the United States to prescribe extra labeled uses in animals, but only under specific conditions. And one of these conditions is that ELDU is limited to situations where an animal's health is threatened or where the animal may suffer or die without the treatment. Also, veterinarians must follow FDA's ELDU regulations. And it's illegal to use a conditionally approved drug or an index drug in an extra labeled manner. These drugs have to be used exactly as stated on the label. And then again, ELDU can only be used for therapeutic uses. So then you might ask, well, when can I use a veterinary extra label use? And this could be when there is no animal drug that is approved for the intended use. Or it could be that there is an animal drug approved for the intended use, but not with the active ingredient that you need, such as the approved drug has been shown to be ineffective. Or it could be when there is an animal drug approved for the intended use, but not in the required dosage form. So for example, such as you need a liquid form, but the approved drug is only in tablet form. Or it could be when there is an animal drug approved for the intended use, but it's not in the concentration that you need. So as I mentioned, there are some specific conditions that are required for extra labeled drug use, and I'll go into each one of these a little bit further. So as Pat already mentioned, there must be a valid veterinary client-patient relationship or VCPR established. I'll talk a little bit about the specific conditions required for ELDU in food animals. And then again, mention the FDA's list of drugs that are prohibited from ELDU in animals. So for the valid veterinary client-patient relationship, to establish this, the veterinarian assumes responsibility for medical judgments about the health of an animal and the need for medical treatment. And this is where the client has agreed to follow the veterinarian's instructions. Also, the veterinarian has sufficient knowledge of the animal to develop a general or preliminary diagnosis of the medical condition and is readily available for follow-up in case of adverse drug reactions or any treatment failure. Also, the veterinarian has to have recently seen and is personally acquainted with the care of the animals and has recently examined the animal and made medically appropriate and timely visits to the premises. And then you'll want to also check your state VCPR definitions, because they could be more specific than the federal ones, as for example, to what it means to have a timely visit to the premises. Also, I know Pat did cover this, but again, due to the COVID pandemic, FDA temporarily did not enforce the federal requirements for an in-person animal examination or premise visit to establish a VCPR. However, this flexibility does expire February 21st of this year, so you may want to make a note of that. All right, and now moving on to companion versus food-producing animals and the differences here. In companion animals, an approved human drug can be prescribed for ELDU, even if an approved animal drug is available. However, this is not the case for food-producing animals. So in food animals, FDA prohibits ELDU of an approved human drug if there's a drug approved for food-producing animals that you can use instead. All right, and then as mentioned, there are a list that FDA of drugs that FDA prohibits ELDU in animals, such as chloramphenicol, clenbuterol, and the fluoroquinolones. There's also many others, so you may want to check out that website that FDA has for the full and entire list. And then also something else to keep in mind, that record keeping is very important for ELDU. It's necessary to have complete records, and the records must be kept for a minimum of 2 years as required by the FDA, or as otherwise required by state law, whichever one is longer. And the records must be made available to FDA personnel for copying and verifying upon request. The records themselves must include information such as the condition that is to be treated, the animal species treated, and the identity and number of treated animals. And for food-producing animals, this could be done on a group, herd, or flock basis. Records also must include the established name of the drug, including its active ingredient, the treatment dosage and duration, and for food-producing animals must include the withdrawal, withholding, or discard period for food products made from the treated animals. And then also there are requirements for labeling. So the labeling must include the veterinarian's name and address, the established name of the drug, including the active ingredient, route of administration, and dosage form. So for example, you could include something like fenbendazole oral suspension. It also must include the class, species, or identity of the treated animal. An animal should be identified individually or by herd, flock, pen, or by lot. Also, the labeling must include directions for use, including the dosage, frequency, route of administration, and duration, and any cautionary statements. And then for food-producing animals, again, must also include the withdrawal, withholding, or discard period for food products such as milk, meat, or eggs made from the treated animals. So that really covers the basics of veterinary extra label drug use. And I do have to give credit to FDA's website where most of this information did come from. And now I'll open it up for any questions.
Well, we appreciate everyone's time this afternoon, and especially to our speakers. Thank you, ladies. I did want to remind you that this recording will be available on the United States Aquaculture Society YouTube channel, as well as the Aquaculture Education and More YouTube channel. And I put those links in the chat boxes. But I suspect that these ladies will both be open to contact via email or phone if you have additional questions as you move forward. But with that, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next time.